Welcome to Coming from Left Field, where we have conversations about politics, books, and current events with your host, Greg Godels and Pat Cummings. In the early 1970s, Chile was somewhat of a progressive paradise led by socialist Salvador Allende. A strong democracy with rising wages for workers, inflation under control, expanding public health and educational systems. Chile's large copper mines were nationalized, with proceeds going to social programs such as public housing and child welfare. What could go wrong? How about a CIA-backed military coup that resulted in Henry Kissinger handing the keys to the country to Augusto Pinochet, whose dictatorship ranks among the bloodiest and most repressive in modern Latin American history? Let's discuss. Warm greetings. We are here with John Dingus today with Greg, and Greg's in Pittsburgh. I'm in Tacoma. And where are you, John?
I'm in Bethesda. I live in Washington, D.C., but at the moment I'm another place.
Okay, good. Hey, before you came on, we just loved your book, Chile in Their Hearts. Fascinating story. Read it cover to cover, had a lot of conversations about it. And I can't tell you how pleased we are to have you tell this. And just for a little background, you're an American investigative journalist, author, and a lot of your work was involved with Latin America, especially during the military dictatorships 1970s. Did I get that correct?
Yes, I went down there in 1972 after being a reporter for a couple of years in a paper in Iowa, and I wanted to be a foreign correspondent. So I figured I would do it the quick way, meaning I went down there as a freelancer instead of waiting around 10 years to get a job, which might not ever have happened. So I arrived during the government of Salvador Allende, revolutionary socialist government, which I was very excited about. And I stayed for 6 years. I always say that I was a better journalist when I had to cover the dictatorship than when I covered Allende because I was too soft. I was so favorable. I was so excited that um, I have to say that my writing, my journalism wasn't as good. But during the dictatorship, when I really had to get the hard facts, I had to write in a way that was irrefutable, and I had to face of course, the repression in the government. I did much better work, and I've been
And
writing
you,
about Chile and that part ever since.
yeah, and your books, 1991, Our Man in Panama was Manuel Noriega. Your 2004 book was on the Condor years. We've got to talk about that. Your involvement with that. The 2014 book, Assassination in Embassy Row, and then your most recent book, which is about Chile, 1970, 73. Well, back up a little bit. How did you become a journalist? How did you get into this career and find yourself writing for newspapers in Chile in 1970, 73?
It wasn't my first career. I started out, I was an English major in college, but I was a seminarian. I was going to be a Catholic priest. They sent me to Europe. That was a great opportunity. I spent 3 years studying theology uh, in Innsbruck, Austria, right after
Oh,
the Olympics had happened in Innsbruck. It's where I learned ski. It was a wonderful opportunity, but it was not the career that was cut out for me. And after 3 years, actually a year from being ordained, I left and went back to the States. And within a fairly short time, I discovered my real career, which was as a journalist. I'd never had a journalism course in my life. but I guess I knew how to write. I'd helped edit a book with some colleagues in Innsbruck on theology, on the theology of faith. So I guess I was literate, and had an English major, and the Des Moines Register decided that they'd give me a tryout.
Mm-hmm.
And they trained me as a copy editor, and then they made me a police reporter for the Des Moines Tribune. And that's how I got into journalism. I always say I felt like I died and gone to heaven. I loved it so much,
Uh-huh.
and never have changed my feeling about journalism ever since. It's been a wonderful career, and most of it, of course, involving foreign journalism, international journalism. I was a correspondent for various publications when I was in Chile until 1978. And then I came back to the United States and worked on the foreign desk of the Washington Post. Eventually, I kept going back and forth to Washington, to Latin America. I did a PBS documentary on Chile on the 10th anniversary of the military coup called Chile by Reason or by Force.
Mm-hmm.
And then a couple of years after that, I started working for National Public Radio,
Mm-hmm.
and I was on the foreign desk. That we were actually creating the foreign desk at NPR. I was one of the first people hired, and my job was to create a network of correspondents in Latin America, which I was well equipped to do because I knew all my colleagues that I had worked with that had come through Chile that were posted in various places, freelance journalists like myself most of the time. And so I built up the coverage on Latin America for National Public Radio. I also was in charge of Africa and Asia. There were only a few editors back then, and you know I loved working for NPR. Eventually, I became managing editor in the early 1990s and editorial director. And in the meantime, wrote my book on Panama in 1988, 88, 89.
Mm-hmm. Your story about Chile and what Chile was like in the 1970s. We're all three the same age. I went to the March on Washington. Greg has been extremely active in an anti-war movement. We're all kind of brothers together in that cohort of people. Greg went to Woodstock, this kind of thing. You show up in Chile and describe what Chile was like when you and a lot of Americans went to that country at this period of time, and why you went.
Well, I was a journalist, but I was a political radical, like I'm sure you guys were.
Hmm.
We, I always adhered to the profession, but I've always felt that your politics uh, are one thing, and you can do a profession like journalism, even though you have politics. And so I and many of the Americans who ended up in Chile we participated in the civil rights movement when we were in college. We we then, of course, were subject to the draft. I escaped the draft by getting a teaching job. Radicalized all of us. You have to admit that nothing radicalizes like the possibility of being sent to, carry an M16 in the swamps of Vietnam. And so I then of course, protested against the war in Vietnam, like so many Americans did. And by the late 1970s, late 1960s, uh, Nixon had been elected. The anti-war movement seemed to fizzle out. The progressive movement had degenerated into infighting. There was violence. 1970, there were more than 1,000 bombings in the United States. Not many people were hurt by them because they were aimed at physical institutions rather than people, thank goodness. But it was a very tumultuous time in the United States that we don't talk about very much, as we are in another very tumultuous time. Um, Many of us, including uh, Charles Horman and Frank Teruggi, who are the subject of the investigation in my book, we went to Latin America because we thought that the ideals that we had fought for uh, in the United States, but were not successful in bringing to reality, we thought there was a chance of doing that in Latin America, particularly in Chile. It was the far and away the best story, the most interesting story in Latin America from a journalistic point of view. Salvador Allende, a socialist, led a coalition of center-left and leftist parties, including the Communist Party, which is a quite important party in the Chilean political scene. And he had a program that that was revolutionary, but not like a violent revolution. It was a totally peaceful revolution. He talked about it as uh, a revolution with empanadas and vino tinto, with red wine and empanadas. Uh, it was a. I landed in Chile in October of 1972, and I said, "This place is going to change my life." And indeed it did. As the plane was landing, I looked around. I saw this dry uh, countryside. I saw these magnificent mountains, um, and I made my way into the center of Santiago in the middle of a general strike by the opposition against Allende, so that everything was closed down. Uh, it was already an adventure. And I realized that this was not going to be a walk in the park. This was that the revolution was not happening just one step in front of the other. The opposition was incredibly strong. Uh, and I met in that process hundreds, well, I mean, I knew of hundreds and thousands of Latin Americans, Europeans, and Americans who had come down to Chile for the same reason. In fact, I was at a film festival at the Catholic University in my first weeks in Santiago, and uh, I run into a guy who was my classmate in Innsbruck, Austria. A guy who had also been studying for the priesthood, had left to do something else, but he stayed in missionary work or progressive work. And he was working with people in Chile and eventually went on to Peru. So this was a world gathering of progressives. It was amazing. I actually did the research to calculate how many foreigners of that kind were in Chile, and it was about 20,000.
Oh
And
my God.
that would include thousands and thousands of Latin American exiles whose countries, in many cases, had already been taken over by right-wing dictatorships. So we're talking about Brazil, Uruguay, Bolivia, and Paraguay, and soon to be joined by Uruguay and Argentina. So the progressive movements, leftist movements, which were very strong at this time in Latin America, uh, were in a battle between the right, supported by the United States, uh, the left, inspired by Cuba, uh, and half-hearted support by the Soviet Union, which really did virtually nothing to support the Latin American leftist movements. It was one of the main battles of the Cold War in the 1970s, and Chile, as I arrived, was in the center of it. This was where the battle was. We are able to see after the fact. This was where the battle was being fought. The United States was involved in covert activities. Um, so I can tell that story about Allende was elected in 1970. This is 2 years before I arrived. Uh, and Richard Nixon and Henry Kissinger covertly, in secret meetings, empowered, charged the CIA with the job of making sure that Allende should not be a success. Because if he were a success with a nonviolent revolution that supports democracy, this could be an idea that would spread all over Latin America, perhaps other parts of the world. The immediate plan by Henry Kissinger, and these are documents that were released over the years. We were talking before we went on the podcast about the Church Committee. Many of these documents were released during the Church Committee, and many, many since, so that you can really see a day-to-day story of how Henry Kissinger was commanding the troops to make sure that Allende was not successful. And the first thing that he did was try to orchestrate a military coup in 1970. Well, not the one in 1973 that was successful, but in 1970, he the CIA paid for and recruited a group of military people, former military people, and a group of right-wing thugs to try to pull off a military coup with the support of some of the Chilean right wing. It was unsuccessful, but it resulted in the assassination of the head of the Chilean armed forces, a very prominent general who unquestionably supported democracy, supported Chile's constitution. And he would have refused to go along with any effort to get rid of Allende. And so this coup was launched. He was killed, but it was unsuccessful. And Allende was inaugurated in October of 1970. This is the environment this is the type of opposition that Salvador Allende and his coalition faced. The most powerful government in the world had already tried to orchestrate a coup to stop him. And this activity to undermine Allende, undermine the revolution, continued for the entire 3 years until there was a successful military coup in 1973.
So, Greg, was it on your radar? You're a little more active in the anti-war movement than I was. Was it on your radar at how important events were at that time in 1970 down in Chile? Did you know people that were there? Were you?
Yeah. In your book, you mention the comparison with the Spanish Civil War for another generation. And I think that's a very, very apt description. And that's kind of the way that's the kind of way I related to it, because I was, my commitment was to socialism in general, here as well as in other places. And I think it was a moment when people were particularly frustrated here. And so international events, the balance of forces internationally had shifted with the Vietnam War going the way it was going, with South Africa being a hotspot, and so on and so forth. So people were looking to help somewhere else, as they did in the 30s with the Spanish Civil War. And I think a lot of young people, therefore, went to Chile or tried to impact things in Chile, be helpful in Chile in the way they tried to be helpful in Spain. And of course, subsequently, there was a similar but a smaller scale movement in Nicaragua with solidarity in Nicaragua and so on. But solidarity in a time when things domestically were very negative, but things internationally were very exciting, was the way to go if you were a leftist. That's the what you felt.
Right.
I mean, that's the way you felt about the world. And some people, not me, but people like that I knew, and then people, of course, like John, decided to go there and help and be part of it. So that was the moment. That was kind of the moment for those of us that were active. But your analogy in your book with Spain, I think, is a very apt one, John. Maybe you could elaborate a bit on that.
Yeah, when of course, the book is about the death of these two Americans and my investigation of what actually happened. So it is a book about about violence, the violence of the Chilean military, the Chilean right wing, with the support of the U.S. government, to prevent a democratic socialist experiment, a leftist experiment, from being successful. In the One of the most important and vivid connections to Spain is Pablo Neruda, the Nobel Prize winning. I mean, probably my favorite poet in the whole world. I mean, he's a magnificent uh, poet, and he was in Spain in 1936. He was actually a consular officer. Uh, it was kind of a sinecure for a well-known literary figure, gave him a chance to live in Europe for a while. The war breaks out in Spain, and he immediately is in Madrid on the day that the war arrives in Madrid. There's a horrendous bombing by the uh, military forces, the Franco forces, against Madrid, and Pablo Neruda writes a book of poetry starting with that first attack, and I quote from that in the first chapter of the book to make the point of the connection between Chile and Spain, and Pablo Neruda, who then, number one, his book of poetry called Spain in Their Hearts, España en el Corazón, as the inspiration for the title of my book. And he becomes the solidarity leader in Europe to raise money to support the Republican Army, and the other major solidarity movements were from the United States. The Abraham Lincoln Brigade was 2,500 American soldiers, many of them connected to the Communist Party, arrived on ships, arrived in any way they could, sometimes carrying their own weapons, to fight alongside the Spanish Republic. Of course, it was ultimately unsuccessful, and as again, unfortunately, a connection to Chile, where the revolution was defeated by the forces of the right wing. In Spain, obviously, fascist forces allied with Hitler's movement in Germany. In Chile, a similarly fascist, although not Nazi, not more typical of the right-wing authoritarian movements of today. They were the opposition, but the important thing is that in both cases, the effort to defeat the revolutionary experiment is violent. It is unconditional opposition, no negotiations. This is either we kill you or you kill us. It was, the kind of violence that we see, in a sense, we're seeing today. The
Right.
idea that if we don't defeat, to put it in the connection with Trump's people, many of them think if we don't defeat the left, if we don't defeat what he calls the forces of the left, which are the Democratic Party, and of course, I think I'm in a group of people who don't consider the Democratic Party particularly leftist, but if they the only way to win with them is to obliterate them. This kind of, and whether that will result in violence or not in the United States, we don't know, and that's of course the subject of a larger conversation. But in Chile and Spain, that's the environment that you were in. It was on the part of the light on the right, it was, we need to eliminate you physically. That's the only way we think that we can stop the leftist movement. On the left, that was not the same. There were violent revolutionary groups. They were Marxist. and some of them were engaged in armed struggle, and I write about them. And my main characters, Charlie and Frank, um, they were, particularly Frank, were sympathetic to that kind of revolutionary, uh, revolutionary movement, which was very strong at the time. But the mainstream of the Allende movement was not devoted to armed struggle. Uh, Certainly, there were people who thought that democracy is not going to be a path to winning the revolution, and that ultimately we're going to have to take up arms. That there was an important segment within the Allende movement. But the people that voted for Allende because he was going to bring a peaceful road to socialism. And it was the right wing that resorted to violence to defeat this movement. And again, we have to say, with the support of the United States.
When this was going on, Allende was getting inflation under control, land reforms, taking the copper industry and spending the money, nationalizing it, spending money on child welfare, education. There was this government organization of all the great books for a buck at kiosks. There was a sexual revolution that was occurring in Southern America. The machismo culture was being inundated with sort of a little bit of the hippie vibe from up north. Music was radically changing. It was it was just this, I don't know, how would you say back in the 70s? It was a happening. I mean, it was where all of this, I didn't believe 20,000 Americans came down there. And you
And
have this book is centered about these two young men, Frank and Charles, who, with all of this, excitement, find themselves in Chile. Describe who these people were. Also, the famous book, the movie about this, Missing, was about these folks. Also, I think you mentioned so.
your description of my description of the way it was in Chile was right on. The one word you were searching for was fun. It was
Ah,
fun. It was not only inspirational and politically dynamic, it was it was a hell of a lot of fun. And Charlie and Frank, um, who arrived around the same time I did, uh, were having a great time, but they were also involved politically. And the larger group of Americans, in the broad sense of the word Americans, were mainly Latin Americans, and probably 500 people from the United States who were involved in the leftist solidarity with Allende. There were other people, obviously. There were people from the embassy. There were business people who weren't necessarily sympathetic to Allende, but there were religious people. There were people, a very strong religious missionary movement, also allied with the left. Uh, it was it was everything. It was liberation theology, and it was sexual liberation. I've never made that connection before, but it really shows you how exciting this
yeah.
was. So, who were Charlie and Frank? Charlie was a Harvard graduate, grew up on the Upper East Side of Manhattan. His father was a businessman who, from all I can find out, voted almost always for moderate Republicans. He was actually knew Jacob Javits, the famous Republican senator from New York, and Senator Javits, when his son um, disappeared, he was enlisted to help out to try to find out what happened to Charlie. Um, and Charlie was a journalist like me, um, a freelancer. He had a fair amount of experience, maybe kind of the equivalent of me, a couple of years working as a documentary filmmaker in Seattle for King Productions. and they were doing progressive films, anti-war films. This is a commercial television corporation, but was doing progressive documentary work. And Charlie got a job with some other Ivy League producers who became this group of friends, and they were important sources in my ability to tell the story of his political evolution, together with his desire to be a journalist, to be a writer, and to continue working in film. And he and his wife Joyce um, uh, met and married in, well, he was working in New York, and they decided, as young couple, they were going to have their great adventure. They were going to travel all the way to the southern tip of South America, to Chile, and to see this revolution that was going on. Uh, Partly political, partly just an adventure. They bought a Chevy truck, put a camper on the back, and basically they traveled around Latin America for almost a year before they actually made their way all the way down to Chile. They spent considerable time in Mexico and Cuernavaca. Some people from the era remember Ivan Illich and the famous countercultural philosopher, also a former priest, actually a priest. He never was a former priest. And that was a language school. I ended up at the same language school at the same time, and that was the one time that I met Charlie, uh, standing beside his truck, while we were both there at Cuernavaca studying Spanish. Many people who I've subsequently remained friends with had also gone to Cuernavaca. This was the stepping stone for progressives on their way down to the adventure of South America. Frank had a different path to get to Chile. He was a student. He was somewhat younger. He was in his early 20s. Charlie and I were on the border of 30 when we arrived in Chile. Frank was an economics student. He was at Berkeley and a couple other universities. He quit school, or paused his education, because he wanted to get a real education in progressive economics by going to Chile. And he worked at the post office to get enough money to do it. His father was a union activist, a teletype operator, uh, and again, a very important union for progressive politics in the United States. And Frank goes from a Catholic education in which priests at a high school and a college prep high school in the Chicago area called Notre Dame uh, uh, prepared him not only academically but theologically, with liberation theology and a view of Latin America as a place where things were happening, where there was the possibility of social change. And Frank becomes excited about the idea, the same trajectory of all of us in the anti-war movement, in the civil rights movement, disillusionment. I'm going to go to Latin America, raises his own money, and gets down there between hitchhiking and cheap tickets. And Frank arrives in early 1972, and immediately begins voluntary work with campesinos, with the peasant workers who were being revolutionized and were the beneficiaries of the agrarian reform. And he gangs up, or I'll use the word, with a group of Brazilians, young Chileans, and they go to a farm in south of Santiago, and are trying to organize the workers. They're doing they call it alphabetization, literacy training, but they were doing political training. And he was associated with the MIR, the far left group called the MIR, the Movement of the Leftist Revolution. Um, and uh, and Frank was uh, always associated with that leftist movement. So both of these men, young men, arrive in Chile with the idea of kind of a political adventure in a romantic revolution, and pretty indistinguishable from what I was trying to do. Uh, they, of course, had a different. Uh, Tragically, both of them, for reasons that I try to explain in the book, were killed shortly after the 1973 September 1973 military coup. Um, they were killed as part of the general repression that was unleashed on the Chilean population. But I conclude that they were killed because of their political connections, because of the political work that they were and the political people that they were associated with. And that's the investigative part of the book is to clarify what actually happened to them and what was the actual role of the U.S. government. The movie Missing is a wonderful movie. Uh, Jack Lemmon and Sissy Spacek. Jack plays Horman's father, who went down there to try to find him, and Sissy Spacek is Joyce Horman, Frank's wife, and Charlie's wife. And the movie is at the time I wrote a review of it with Saul Landau, my friend and co-author, and we said that this was an authentic representation of the terror of the military coup in Chile, and of the defeated promise of the Allende government, and highly recommended it. It gave people a real sense of what could have been and how horrible it was, how terrific it was when it was overthrown. And the only thing that I ultimately found was incorrect about the movie was the movie very heavily suggests that the United States somehow targeted Charlie and was responsible for having him killed. I thought at one point that I would be able to find the evidence to prove that, because I shared that idea that might have happened too. But ultimately, my discovery, my conclusion after years of investigation was that the United States was not involved in the assassination, in the killing of either Charlie or Frank. But the United States was very heavily involved and complicitous with the human rights violations in general, and with respect to Charlie and Frank, helped the Chileans cover it up.
Right.
So that's the premise for the book and the conclusion of the book.
Thoughts, Greg?
Yeah, I mean, I respect the research that was done. I mean, it's really extensive research on U.S. involvement in the actual killing, but I wouldn't discount. I think the absence of evidence in this case isn't the absence of an engagement or the possibility of an engagement with the U.S. But the U.S. was up there, and always are. And what we know today about intervention in all these countries in Latin America, but also in Europe and the Portuguese Revolution. It's almost a presumption I make that the U.S. would be involved. So I don't have any further evidence, but the CIA, AIFLD, they were up to their eyeballs in it. They supported the trucker strike with money, As you mentioned earlier, they supported El Mercurio and other newspapers and politicians they gave money to. So it's even in the best case scenario, it's hard to imagine that someone in the CIA or AIFLD or a military attaché or whatever didn't get the word or didn't hear or get the buzz that there were some Americans that were being held in the stadium and didn't do anything. I mean, passively. So,
Yeah.
but it doesn't detract from the book because the overall message of the book is is the great disappointment that an opportunity to make a change in Latin America that could have been an example for the rest of Latin America in the future as it came out of all these military dictatorships, a direction to go in. We saw it revived again in Venezuela with Hugo Chavez and a similar kind of investment. And a lot of us who were observers of the Chilean experiment, we saw two factors. One was the military. I mean, when you have a strong U.S. often educated, often trained military, but certainly one that the U.S. has great impact upon what they do, it's very difficult to have a peaceful revolution because they won't tolerate it. And two is the question of the middle classes. So Chile had a substantial, in Latin America, one of the more substantial middle stratas, and they were key to trying to make this thing go forward. It's sort of an unspoken reality, but it's true. And I think the success of Hugo Chavez is precisely because the military was not the same problem as it was in Chile. So they were able to overcome that kind of thing. But it's tragic to see the promise that was there denied the people of Chile. Really sad. There's a movie, documentary by Patricio Guzman. I don't know if
It
you
was
knew him.
fun, right?
Yeah, if you met him or knew him, I think he's mentioned in your book. But it's a trilogy. I think there are three different components to it. That's really a great, great way to come to understand more about what really went on in Chile, and what they were trying to do, and also what was stifled. Did you
Yeah,
meet him?
Patricia, I don't know him personally, but I'm not the important person in this book. Charlie Horman did work directly with Patricio Guzman. And Charlie, as a young, beginning documentary filmmaker, had made connections with the Chilean film industry called Chile Films, where Patricio was working. And he had other friends. He was quite well connected with a group of uh, good, really top drawer filmmakers, including Patricio Guzman. Uh, the film industry, the filmmaking activity was an incredibly important part of this environment that we've been talking about of Chile and during the Allende government, and there were magnificent films made, and including the filming of State of Siege by Costa Gavras. And Charlie actually, Joyce, his wife, got a part in that film, a very brief one. I'm not sure if it actually made it to the final cut. Charlie says in the letter that I have that he also tried out, but he said that Costa Gavras thought he was too scruffy for what the kind of part that he needed. He's kind of laughing at himself. So this environment of, again, a revolution and literacy and literature and filmmaking, artistic uh, uh, advances was very much part of what was going on. I did want to come back to what you said because about the involvement of the U.S. government. I really have to engage with this question. Ariel Dorfman just recently did a review of my book, and he, to his credit, as a well-known leftist writer who I've known for many many years, he was somebody who worked in the Allende government and came to the United States, and eventually, of course, becomes a quite famous writer, in his review, he addresses the question that you raised, that the left has been invested very heavily in the idea not only that the United States was involved in the military coup, but that in this particular case of Charlie Horman, because of that movie, that the United States must have had a direct role in actually killing or pinpointing, targeting Charlie for that killing. And he said, Dingus finally gets to the bottom of that story, and it is it's the kind of thing that absence of evidence is not the evidence of a killing, uh, or the other way around. It's the fact that this was alleged. Um, I explained in great detail where the story comes from and why it was legitimate and understandable and plausible for all of us that we believed for so long that the U.S. was involved. There was actually a Chilean intelligence officer who told this story, and he said that he was there when a CIA agent and the head of Chilean military intelligence gave the death sentence to Charlie Horman. That happened in 1976. His name was Rafael Gonzalez, and he, of course, appears briefly in the film. That seemed to be not only important evidence, but determinative evidence that you had an inside source seeming to say that the U.S. was directly involved in killing this young American. Well, I got to the bottom of that. I talked to that agent. He's now in his late 80s, but still coherent. And I received I got the documents that he wrote in the early 2000s, in which he recants the story and tells the story, which I won't go into in detail, but it's a fascinating story of why he decided that he had to make up this story about the CIA killing Charlie Horman. And so I think that as a journalist, I've always followed the evidence. And when the evidence in this case contradicted my preconceptions, I had to follow my evidence and not go along with what I had thought for so many years. And many people on the left who have read the book have said that they're convinced by my evidence. And certainly there are people who said, no, we think that we need to leave the question open. We think that there is still the possibility. So I did the best job I could to clarify something that I thought was very important. But perhaps even more important, I do show exactly what the U.S. role was. I say they didn't kill these two Americans, but the involvement in supporting the human rights violations of the Chilean government, in which over the course of the Pinochet government, more than 3,000 people were murdered, and 30,000 people or more were tortured. And all of this is documented. These are not estimated. And the U.S. was complicitous and participated in defending this murderous regime from beginning almost almost to the end. It was the finding out exactly what the U.S. did and what the U.S. did not do, to me, is an important part of investigating the truth. And to be able to say that, yes, the reason I'm so sure of their complicity is because I'm also willing to say there are certain things that they were not guilty of.
We have an interesting connection with the story, your story. We had a guest on our show, Jeffrey Fox. He had a book called Rabble, which was about the Paris Commune. It was a fictionalized novel about the Paris Commune. A really interesting book. But I got to know Jeffrey a little bit, and he mentioned that he had a connection with Chile because something it stays with me. And it turns out that in 1974, he and Frank Teruggi's dad went down on with a labor group to investigate things. And I don't know if you knew this story or not, but they were there in 74. Fineglass, DeMeo, Teruggi, and Jeffrey Fox. And Jeffrey wrote it up. He wrote up what he saw, wrote up what they learned about it. A very damning picture that he was drawing about Chile in 1974. He comes back to the States, and he was a writer for the American Teacher, AFT's American Federation of Teachers newspaper. And it was killed by a co-warrior who was part of the leadership of the American Federation of Teachers. They wouldn't let him run that article about the realities in Chile. Instead, they ran something on Solzhenitsyn because of their Cold War attitude towards it. But
Mhm.
he remembers Teruggi very well. I mean, the dad, the father, and going down there with him.
Well,
Yeah, I mentioned that in the book, and I know Jeff Fox. He never told me the story of of the the article he wrote that got killed because
Oh, he didn't tell you that story.
yeah,
Yeah, I wrote about. I'll send you a link to the article I wrote
great.
from the information he gave me.
so I
I've
just
interviewed
want
a
to.
number of people from that trip.
I'd like to go back to the actual coup. Um, First of all, Henry Kissinger has got to be one of the most horrible people in the world. I mean, when you look to think at his funeral to have Hillary Clinton there, and he's just anyway. That's another story. The coup itself set in motion so many bad things. It stopped this progressive experiment, this socialist experiment that could have spread. It successfully did that. It brought in economic neoliberalism, the disappearing. You talk about the pattern of just taking people and getting rid of them and then blaming the families. It established that. The torture, the lack of political any kind of participatory democracy was just crushed for decades. It was an absolute horrible, horrible event, and it was even though we might not have been, we were complicit in it. We were cheerleaders for it. We were spending money on newspapers that supported this event. We were major players in this. Is that correct?
Absolutely. I This was a history-changing event. The coup in Chile was really the end of the leftist uprising, popular uprising in Latin America for decades. And well, and of course, you mentioned the the civil wars in the Central America were an upsurge again of leftist movements. But in the large countries of South America, uh, uh, this was the end of the leftist movement. For all practical purposes, it was a successful counter-revolution. So, to give you an example, in 1976, with the fall of Argentina to a military coup, 80% of the population of South America was under military control. 80%. The only countries that were not under military control were Venezuela and Argentina and Guyana and several smaller countries. All the others were under military control. Uh, the So this was not just Chile. This was a geopolitical catastrophe from the point of view of democracy, of leftist progressive social movements, and the culture of pursuing political change. It was a psychological disaster for so many people, young people, who believed that a better life was possible. And these people are now, of course, much, much older. And uh, it it was devastating to the lives of hundreds of thousands of people. There were at least 1 million immigrants from South America, from perhaps even from Chile. I'm not sure exactly whether that number would hold for Chile, but South Americans from Uruguay, Argentina, Bolivia, Chile streamed uh, into Europe and to Venezuela, Colombia, Mexico, and the United States as exiles, as political exiles. And of course, this is a very positive movement for those places where they arrived, because these were very intelligent, very capable people who had, in many, many cases, outstanding careers as immigrants. And then, of course, as things changed, they were able to come back to their home countries, and many of them become the leadership of the democratic governments of Uruguay, Argentina, Chile, and the other countries. But it was an earthquake politically and geopolitically, what happened in the 1970s. Which brings us maybe to Operation Condor, right? Because we were gonna
You've got
talk about it.
do an overview of Operation Condor. So that's again something in which we were knowledgeable, we supported. This is in 1975 or six. Tell us what, and am I correct that you kind of are the Cy Hirsch of that story? You broke the Operation Condor story. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct. I mean, my work
Okay.
is the most extensive, and I wasn't the one that discovered it because I was the FBI,
Right.
but and that's significant because it was the FBI that revealed it publicly, while the CIA, which knew about it, uh,
Mhm.
kept it hidden for many, many years. So let me tell you what Operation
Okay.
Condor is. In this period that we've just been talking about, um, the countries by 1976 had all become military dictatorships. Even in Argentina, the military, even before the coup of March 1976, the military was in charge of repression in Argentina. So in 1975, all of these countries meet in Santiago, Brazil, Uruguay, Argentina, Bolivia, Paraguay. They meet convened by the secret police of Chile, called DINA, with the intention of forming an alliance that will allow the repressive activity of the security forces to cross borders. They were free to cross into each other's countries and to conduct joint operations against the foreigners, against the exiled who are living in each other's countries.
And
Um,
that includes surveillance, kidnapping, torture, assassination, destroying leftist unions. It was a very anyway,
and,
correct?
dis- and disappearance. Now,
And the disappearance.
this is the apex of the repression, because the repression was going on inside each country with different degrees of severity. 9,000 people were killed in Argentina, 3,000 in Chile, probably 1,000 in Paraguay. Uruguay only killed a couple hundred people. They killed more people outside of their country through Operation Condor than they killed inside their country. This is what I call the grim mathematics of repression. When you start counting who was killed and what happened to everybody. Operation Condor was the 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 crown to this, the keystone to this edifice of total control and total defeat of the left, because it meant that even if you escaped the repression in your own country, the repression came after you internationally. First of all, in all of the other countries of Latin America, all of the Southern Cone, which were dictatorships, particularly Argentina, at least 15,000 exiles from Chile arrived in Argentina. There were also enormous numbers of Bolivians, Paraguayans, Brazilians, Uruguayans. Of course, Uruguay is like a suburb of Argentina. They cross back and forth over the river, and there's tremendous contact between Argentina and Uruguay. Operation Condor descends as this multinational security force to do joint operations by Chile, Uruguay, Bolivia, for example, to track down the Chileans, Uruguayans, and Bolivians who were living in Argentina. And they then had special prisons, special secret torture centers for the international prisoners. And in those torture centers, they would allow security people from the other countries to come in and do interrogations. Similar things happen in some of the other countries. For example, Paraguay, there were several big operations in which foreigners were arrested in Paraguay, and then Uruguayan and Chilean security forces would come to Paraguay to interrogate the people that had been arrested. This was the type of operations that were going on. First of all, joint intelligence, which was maximized by a computer system, and we're talking at the birth, really, of real effective computing and databases, transmission of this information among the 6 countries of Operation Condor by a telex system. So it was communication in real time to pursue the targets they were going after, and then the actual operations are joint operations of the various security forces operating inside each of the countries. And those were and then of course the most notorious was operations outside of Latin America, where the countries put together hit squads, assassination squads, to go to Europe to track down important leadership in the opposition to the military governments. And the most famous of the Condor assassinations was in Washington, D.C., when the Chileans organized the assassination of Orlando Letelier, who had been the foreign minister and the former ambassador to the United States. And that was the subject of my first book, Assassination on Embassy Row. And that's the first book that has a description based on real internal sources from the CIA and the FBI describing what Operation Condor was and its involvement in the Letelier assassination.
This was torture. This was kidnapping. This was disappearing, and it was this fraternity of these countries. I mean, we think it's bad when one Washington Post reporter gets cut up by a bone saw by Saudi Arabia. This was an organized fraternity of countries, and we knew about it, supported it, monitored it, and did nothing about it. I mean, we're complicit in it. Am I correct?
So this is the story of U.S. complicity in the massive human rights violations in Latin America in the 1970s. Henry Kissinger considered himself the international defender of these military governments because they were restoring order and were defeating the left. So the United States was involved at every stage in the takeover of Latin America, of South America, by these military governments. There's no question about it. And They were supporting them with logistically, with military training, with military equipment, and of course financially through the economic system. So we were. Henry Kissinger at one point says about Pinochet. Pinochet is perceived as our guy, and so it was. There's no question the connection between the United States and these military governments. We loved them; they loved us. Now, Operation Condor was in a sense, a fulfillment of one of the messages from the United States, which was that if you want to defeat an international enemy, you have to organize internationally. And I have some documents, including some from that were in the Church Committee, which talk about training by the CIA in Chile in the first year after the military coup. And the CIA, in order to defend itself, to say, no, we weren't teaching them how to torture and kill people. We were teaching them how to organize the campaign against the left internationally. Okay. So essentially, this is the impetus for something like Operation Condor. I do not say that, and I do not believe that there's evidence to show that the United States was the author of Operation Condor, but certainly this was in tune with the message that the United States was putting out to these military governments, which is you have to coordinate among yourselves. Don't just be isolated governments. So the United States detected, I call it intimacy. The CIA and U.S. military intelligence people, the military training people, were intimately connected through liaison relationships with all of the people who were carrying out Operation Condor, with the individual security forces of each of the countries. We were enmeshed with them. We were giving training to their people in country, and we had top level liaison relationships, which I document in my book, The Condor Years, in great detail, particularly the 2021 edition of The Condor Years, which at this point still it's only exists in Spanish, but I had much more information about the intimacy of these liaison relationships. So we knew what Condor was doing. We had penetrated the meetings at which it was organized. We had, I have a CIA document that is 14 pages long, and it's the plan of operation of the European phase of Operation Condor, which is called Theseus or Teseo. It's for a Greek mythological figure. This was the mythological figure who killed the Minotaur, right? So they named this European phase of Operation Condor for this Greek mythological figure. All of this was known and is documented in CIA reports, which we now have through declassification. Okay, this is. I want your listeners to be convinced that we knew as much. We knew more than anybody in the world about the intimacy of what was going on with Operation Condor. Names of victims, types of operations, reports of torture sessions and interrogations. All of that stuff was in the CIA files. That's the extent, as I said before. I always document exactly what the CIA did and then what they didn't do. So at a certain point, the CIA, in this, I describe this in great detail in my book. At a certain point, the CIA realizes, because of their intimate knowledge, that Operation Condor plans to operate in France and also in Portugal, because there were major centers of leftist operations international leftist operations in those countries, a thing called the Revolutionary Coordinating Junta, which was an international alliance of far left revolutionary groups. So the CIA discovers this very, very shortly after the meeting occurs in which they agreed to do this. And they have a series of meetings, which I have the documents for, in which the CIA says, essentially, I'm paraphrasing, these guys are going to start killing people in our NATO allies. They're going to be conducting terroristic assassination operations inside Europe. We should probably do something about this. And that's the context in which one of the people, Henry Kissinger, I think, said, we are, no, this is not Henry, this is his chief assistant, Harry Schlotterman, his chief assistant for Latin America, said to Henry Kissinger, we should do something about this. We need to head off this wave of international assassinations because, after all, it's being led by Chile, and Chile is perceived as our guy. So they actually try to do something about it. Were they successful? Partly. But of course, they didn't prevent the international assassinations. The most important international assassination occurred in Washington, D.C. They didn't know that that was going to happen until it happened. But I argue that that could have been prevented if they had acted more strongly on the information they did have about this international assassination organization that was being put into operation by these countries. I argue that they should have prevented the assassination, and that's an important part of my book. But in Europe, they were partially successful. I document 21 separate operations that were actually launched by phase 3 of Operation Condor. These were operations outside of Latin America against a total of at least 45 intended victims. And it's hard to say that this is a success because 5 people actually were killed in these operations. But most of the operations were averted because the CIA did alert the European countries that these operations were underway. And so in Europe, the operations were aborted. They were prevented. Some of them were actually in country. The assassins were actually in the countries, but they were prevented from carrying out the operations. So to a certain extent, that was we successfully averted most of the international assassinations.
Well, what happened in 1975 in D.C.?
Then 1976, when Orlando Letelier is killed on Sheridan Circle in Washington, D.C., which I pass by every time I go downtown, that could have been prevented based on the information that the CIA had. And you have to read the story because it's an intelligence failure. They had streams of intelligence. The CIA had streams of intelligence informing them that that these countries were preparing for international assassinations, including in Europe. They had a separate stream of intelligence showing that the Chileans were sending agents to Paraguay, to their Condor ally, to get false passports and then U.S. visas to go to Washington, D.C. to kill Letelier. No, they didn't know the purpose of the mission, but it was a secret mission by the same Operation Condor that they knew were planning assassinations in Europe. They claim, and I've interviewed several of the people, the principals, that they didn't put 2 and 2 together, that they didn't think that the Paraguay operation providing the Chilean agents a way to get to Washington, D.C. with false documents. They didn't connect that to the Operation Condor assassination missions that were being planned for Europe. That's an intelligence failure at best.
Yeah.
At worst, it was, well, we don't want to interfere with what these guys are doing. But in any case, it was a horrendous failure on the part of the CIA because the result was a terrorist attack, probably one of the worst terrorist attacks occurring in the United States before 9/11.
Well, we've been talking this we might set a record for this being our longest podcast, and I feel like I just have scratched the surface. We haven't talked about Venezuela, and Greg, you and I should start a GoFundMe to send John down to Venezuela and cover what's going on.
Does a
Wait,
remarkable job of investigation. It really does.
Huh? Yeah.
Remarkable investigator. It's really great, and I appreciate your very strict journalistic standards. I think that's good, but I tend to be maybe I'm more a conspiracy theorist, and I don't have the same restrictions, journalistic restrictions. But I follow equally serious researchers in Indochina, and we hear the same stories about the CIA. And when it comes up about something that it's really, really ugly, and they always say, well, we didn't know, or we could have, or we should have, whatever. I tend to think that they're up to their eyeballs.
You're talking about Indonesia, probably, right? Well, we
Yeah.
won't go
Yeah,
into that.
yeah, Indonesia, of course, and
Yeah,
Indochina as well. I mean, but it's
right.
so I mean, it's not a difference. I mean, I hold your research in so high regard, and I understand you have these standards, but trying
And
to put a whole picture together of the CIA,
that's
it's an
what
ugly, ugly picture.
that's what ticks me off about John. I'm Irish. I wouldn't let facts get in the way of a good story. And I corresponded with Greg about you, John, and I said he really calls balls and strikes. I mean, even though it'd be a lot better story if the CIA did have, did send the memo to do something. You are very thorough and very accurate, and it's a bad enough story as it is that these little
Exactly.
details don't distract from how remarkably intrusive and problematic our foreign policy is with Central and South America. It's just horrible. So, what are you working
Yeah,
on next?
man. I'm a pretty old guy,
Uh,
so I'm not sure how many more books I got in me, and I'm trying to tell myself I'm not going to write another book about Chile. But then I get tempted. I need to get that updated version of the Condor Years into English.
Yeah.
I I did an expanded version, but major documents were released in 2019. That one that describes the way you organized Teseo was one of those documents, and my book expanded by 150 pages, and I have, it's much, much more complete. But so far that only exists in Spanish. So that's probably going to be the next thing that I do is get my publisher to get that book out in English.
good, good.
Well, John, you are in the category of Cy Hirsch. In my book, you're remarkable, doing such good work and good values. And oh boy, this was a great read. I strongly recommend people pick this book up. It just read like a soap opera at times. It's just remarkable how much regard you have for these two young men and to the whole what was going on in Chile at the time. You can tell you really care about them then and now. So there you go. Thank
Yeah.
you.
Yeah. Thanks for
Okay.
inviting me. I really appreciate it. I really enjoyed the conversation.
All right. You too. Thank you so much, John. Bye now.